In the middle of an extravagant party, with champagne flowing and high society chatter filling the air, a sudden shout cut through it all. "Mommy! Mommy!" The room fell silent as the cry of 7-year-old Thomas echoed, his voice breaking the polished calm. His eyes locked onto Carla, the housekeeper, as he reached out from his wheelchair. 200 guests, from businessmen to politicians, turned in shock. The boy wasn't calling his mother. He was calling her. Carla, frozen in place, felt the weight of 100 stares. What'd she do now? Could she face the truth that everyone was about to question? The atmosphere at the Fraga estate was nothing short of grandeur. Elegant guests mingled in the opulent ballroom, exchanging pleasantries while delicate laughter filled the air. The crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, casting a soft glow over the sea of silk and velvet. Yet, in the midst of the celebration, a sound rang out, sharp and raw, breaking through the sophisticated hum of the party. "Mommy! Mommy!" The voice of Thomas, the young son of Caio Fraga, echoed across the room. His words shattered the elegant facade that had enveloped the mansion. Every conversation halted. Champagne flutes, once poised delicately in the air, froze mid-sip. The glittering crowd of 200 high society guests turned as one, their eyes locking onto the boy in the wheelchair at the center of the room. Thomas, with his bright blonde hair, shining like a beacon under the crystal chandelier, stretched out his arms towards Carla, the housekeeper. His face, filled with the purest joy, held a look of longing. He was waiting for her. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as the whispers began, soft at first, then building into a wave of confusion and judgment. "She's just the housekeeper," someone muttered. "Isn't she? Why is he calling her mommy?" Another voice questioned, the tone dripping with disbelief. Carla, standing frozen with a silver tray of drinks in hand, felt the weight of every eye in the room. Her heart raced. What should she do? Her entire life had been spent working in the shadows, quietly keeping the Fraga household running. She wasn't supposed to be part of this world, certainly not in the way Thomas was calling her. She wasn't his mother. He had one, and she was gone. But Thomas wasn't thinking about titles or labels. He didn't care about class or hierarchy. All he knew was that Carla had been the one to show him love when no one else had. And now, in front of hundreds of people, he was calling her mommy. Her hands shook as she held the tray, her eyes searching the room for Caio, Thomas's father. He stood at the back of the crowd, his eyes wide with shock, a mixture of confusion and something else, something she couldn't quite place. Was it anger? Was it something deeper? The tension in the room thickened as Thomas stretched his arms farther. "Mommy, you came to the party?" Carla's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined this moment would come, and now she had to decide. Would she run to him, embracing him in front of all these people, or would she pull away and leave him alone in his confusion? Either choice felt like it could unravel everything. Carla's heart hammered in her chest. The entire room, once filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, now stood frozen. It felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She had never imagined this day would come. A simple child's call had changed everything. The air around her was thick with judgment, curiosity, and confusion. She glanced at Thomas, still reaching for her, his eyes filled with such innocence and longing that it felt like a dagger to her heart. She had been his caregiver for months now, and in all that time, she had never once felt like a mother to him. She wasn't his mother. She was just Carla, the housekeeper, the woman who cleaned the floors, washed the dishes, and made sure everything was in order. But Thomas had seen her as more than that. He had given her a title that was far more than she deserved. For a moment, she considered walking away. She could just turn and leave the room, escape the gaze of every single person who was now watching her every move. But then she saw Caio again, standing in the back of the room, his face a mask of disbelief. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Carla could have sworn she saw something there, something far more complicated than just surprise. Caio was frozen, his lips parted as if he was about to speak, but no words came. He hadn't been prepared for this. Neither of them had. The whispers started again, louder now, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Who does she think she is, calling herself his mother? She's just a maid. What kind of woman would let the child of her employer call her that? The words were sharp, but they weren't as painful as Carla's own thoughts. She had never wanted to cross any line, never wanted to take on a role that wasn't hers. But here she was, standing in the middle of the room, a child crying out to her for affection that she had so willingly given. She had always been kind to him, always tried to make him smile, even though he had his moments of isolation. But this was different. The silence continued, suffocating. The tension was unbearable. Carla looked down at the tray in her hands, as if it could offer her some kind of comfort, but it only trembled in her grip. She felt like she was being crushed under the weight of expectations she hadn't known existed. Thomas's voice, sweet and desperate, cut through her thoughts again. "Mommy, you came to the party?" he repeated, his tiny arms still stretched out toward her. Without thinking, she dropped the tray onto the nearest table and walked forward, her heart in her throat. She didn't have a choice anymore. He needed her, and despite all the eyes on her, despite the whispers and the judgment, she couldn't leave him like this. The closer she got, the more she realized just how much he had come to rely on her. She had been a constant in his life when his world had fallen apart, when his mother had passed away, and his father had been too consumed by his own grief to see what his son truly needed. It was her presence, her care, that had given Thomas a sliver of hope in a world that had felt so dark. "Mommy, you're here," Thomas said again, his voice trembling with joy. Carla knelt down beside him, her hands gently brushing his hair back. His small face lit up at her touch, and in that moment, she felt a wave of emotion she couldn't control. She had to hold back tears. She wasn't his mother, but in that instant, she realized that for him, she was everything. She was the one he trusted. She was the one who could make him feel safe. The room was still, the onlookers unsure of what to do, but Carla didn't care anymore. She wrapped her arms around Thomas, pulling him close, as he clung to her with the desperation of a child who feared being abandoned once more. As their embrace lingered, she heard the soft murmur of conversation from the crowd, but none of it mattered now. The moment had shifted. Carla and Thomas were together, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. But as she held the boy in her arms, she couldn't ignore the knot of uncertainty that had twisted itself in her stomach. Kaio was still watching them, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher. Was it anger? Confusion? Longing? She pulled away from Thomas and turned her gaze to him. Kaio's face had softened, but the question lingered in the air. What did this mean for them? Carla slowly stood up from her kneeling position beside Thomas, her heart still racing as she wiped her hands on her dress, trying to regain some semblance of composure. The crowd's whispers continued to swirl around her, but this time, they felt distant, like a world away. She had no idea what had just happened, but in that moment, all she cared about was the warmth of Thomas in her arms, his little hands still gripping her, as though he never wanted to let go. "Mommy," Thomas repeated softly, his voice breaking through the haze of confusion that clouded Carla's thoughts. Carla glanced at him, her heart breaking all over again. He had no idea what this had just done, how this small, innocent gesture had shifted everything. The room was still, heavy with disbelief and judgment, but Carla didn't care. She couldn't. Not when she saw the love and trust shining in Thomas's eyes. He had called her his mother, and no matter how impossible it seemed, at that moment, she felt something stir deep within her, a connection she couldn't deny. She looked up to find Kaio standing at the edge of the room, his eyes wide with shock. There was no hiding the confusion on his face. The way his posture was tense and rigid, as though he was trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for them all. His gaze locked with hers, and for a brief, electric moment, Carla saw something flicker there, a mix of uncertainty, vulnerability, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Carla." Kaio's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried across the room. She stiffened at the sound of her name. He hadn't called her by her name in years, since the beginning when she first started working for the Fragas. It was as if she were invisible to him, merely a fixture in the background of his life. But now, in this moment, his eyes were locked on hers, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Before she could say anything, the murmurs from the guests grew louder, edging toward mockery. "Isn't she just a servant?" one woman whispered. "How could she let him call her that?" "Poor child, so confused," a man added. "Someone should stop this." The words stung, but they weren't as painful as the cold realization Carla had already accepted. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't meant to be part of this world. She had never been more aware of her place in the hierarchy than in that moment. Surrounded by opulence, by people who held wealth and power like a shield, and here she was just a housekeeper. Nothing more. But Thomas didn't see that. For him, she wasn't a servant. She was his safe place. His mommy. Kaio took a few hesitant steps forward, and the crowd parted to let him through. His steps were slow, deliberate, and it was clear to Carla that he was trying to process everything that had just transpired. "Carla," Kaio said again, this time with more authority, but still lacking the certainty he'd usually exude in any other situation. "What's going on here? Why did Thomas call you that?" Carla's throat tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words. Was it right to explain what had happened between her and Thomas? Could she tell him how she had spent hours every day caring for his son, helping him find joy in the midst of his pain, simply because it felt right? How could she explain something so deep when she herself wasn't sure of it? I didn't ask him to call me that, Kaio," Carla said softly, her voice trembling slightly as she met his gaze. "He's been through so much, and all I've ever tried to do is give him comfort, something his mother would have given him if she were still here." Her voice faltered, and she looked down at Thomas, who was now clutching the sleeve of her dress with a small, possessive grip. She glanced back up at Kaio, trying to read his expression, but it was hard. His eyes flickered between her and his son, and she could see the internal struggle written all over his face. He was a father, and his instincts were protective. But how could he deny the bond between Carla and Thomas? "Carla, I need to know," Kaio said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "What does this mean? What does this mean for us?" Carla felt a sharp pang in her chest. For us? There was no us. Not in the way Kaio was thinking. She was just a housekeeper, his employee, nothing more. This was a mistake. She had made a mistake by allowing herself to get too close to Thomas, by letting herself care too much. But she couldn't take it back now. "I'm sorry, Kaio," she whispered, her voice breaking. This was never meant to be more than what it is. I'm just here to take care of your son." "But you've done more than that," Kaio said quietly, taking another step toward her. His eyes softened for a moment, and Carla saw the flicker of something she hadn't expected. Recognition. Maybe even something deeper. "You've given him a piece of himself back that none of us could." Carla swallowed hard. She had given everything she could to Thomas. And now, it felt like it was all falling apart. The man standing in front of her, the father of the child she had come to care for as her own, was looking at her with eyes she couldn't quite read. Was it gratitude? Was it something else? Just then, the silence of the room was broken by Thomas's tiny voice, his words carrying a sweetness that made Carla's heart ache. "Mommy, don't go," Thomas pleaded, his voice full of a desperation that no child should have to feel. "Please don't leave me." The words hit Carla like a wave, and for a brief moment, everything else faded into the background. She could hear the whispers, the judgment, the expectations of everyone in that room. But all she could focus on was the child who had called her his mother, the child she had come to love with all her heart. Kaio looked at her, his face a mask of uncertainty. "Carla, what do we do now?" Carla didn't know. She only knew that whatever this was, whatever the future held, it was going to change everything, for better or for worse. The air in the room felt heavier now. The tension was no longer just between Carla and Thomas, but now between Carla and Kaio. The weight of the moment seemed unbearable, and every word they spoke only seemed to make things more complicated. The whispers around them grew louder, more insistent, but neither of them paid attention to them anymore. Carla stood there, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady herself. The words she had just spoken to Kaio echoed in her mind. She wasn't his mother. She was just here to care for him. But as she looked at Thomas, who was still clinging to her like a lifeline, her heart betrayed her. She couldn't deny that she had become something more to him. Whether she liked it or not, she had stepped into a role she hadn't anticipated, and now the world was watching. Kaio's eyes softened as he looked at Thomas, then back at Carla. His brow furrowed, a mix of confusion and something else, something that Carla couldn't quite name. Was it fear? Concern? She couldn't be sure. "I never wanted this, Kaio," Carla said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what to say anymore. The room was so full of judgment, of uncertainty, and she felt like she was drowning in it. "I never wanted to be a part of this. I never wanted to cause any problems." "Carla." Kaio's voice was softer now, gentler. He stepped forward, his expression serious, but also conflicted. "You haven't caused any problems. Thomas, he's just a kid. He doesn't understand everything. He just knows you're the one who's been there for him, the one who has shown him love when no one else would." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but Carla couldn't let herself get lost in it. This wasn't about her and Kaio. It was about Thomas, and she couldn't let herself forget that. "I never wanted to confuse him, Kaio," she said, shaking her head. "I never meant for him to call me that. But I can't take it back now. I can't just ignore the bond that's formed between us. He trusts me, and I care about him more than I should." She looked down at Thomas, who had calmed down a bit but still clung to her, his small hands holding onto her dress. He was so innocent, so unaware of the mess he had just created. He only knew that he had someone who loved him, someone who made him feel safe. Carla's throat tightened. She wanted to pull away, to protect herself from whatever was coming next. But as she looked into Thomas's trusting eyes, she knew she couldn't. Not when he needed her the most. "You don't have to apologize," Kaio said, his voice steady. "But you need to understand that this changes things. We're in a world where appearances matter. And when people see what's happening here, they're going to talk. They already are." He gestured toward the guests, who were still whispering among themselves, their eyes lingering on Carla and Thomas. "You have to be prepared for that." Carla nodded, but the weight of his words didn't settle easily in her chest. "I don't care what they think, Kaio. I really don't." She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving Thomas. "But I can't stay in the background anymore. I've been trying to hide in the shadows, but I can't pretend anymore. I care too much about him." Kaio watched her closely, his eyes narrowing as he processed what she was saying. For a moment, he didn't speak. The tension in the air thickened, as if the world was holding its breath. "I know," he finally said, his voice low, "and that's what scares me." Carla's heart skipped a beat. "What?" Kaio looked around the room, his expression conflicted, before returning his gaze to Carla. "I'm not sure I'm ready to see my son attached to someone else like that. I know he needs love, and I know he needs affection," but his voice trailed off, and Carla could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "It's complicated. You and we're from two different worlds, Carla. And sometimes that kind of divide can't be crossed. Even for Thomas." Carla swallowed hard, trying to push down the hurt that welled up inside her. She wasn't asking for Kaio's approval. She wasn't asking for anything from him. All she wanted was to know that Thomas would be okay, that he wouldn't be lost in the confusion of it all. "I don't need your approval, Kaio," she said, her voice firm. "I just need you to understand that I can't walk away from him. I won't. He's too important to me." Kaio's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he was seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. "I know you care about him," he said quietly. "But this could destroy everything." "I'm not asking you to change anything, Kaio," Carla replied, her voice steady. "I'm asking you to let me be there for him. I'm asking you to let me do my job. And if that means giving him the love he needs, then that's what I'll do." Thomas, hearing the tension in their voices, tugged at Carla's sleeve, his small voice barely audible. "Mommy, are you going away?" Carla's heart shattered at his words. She bent down to his level, cupping his face in her hands, forcing herself to smile. "No, baby, I'm not going anywhere." Thomas's eyes lit up, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, holding her tightly. Carla closed her eyes, holding him back, and in that moment, everything else faded away. She wasn't the housekeeper. She wasn't the woman who cleaned floors and did dishes. She was someone's mother. Maybe not in the traditional sense, but in that moment, that was all that mattered. Kaio watched them, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. The man he had been, distant and controlled, was slipping away, and in its place, a new version of himself was starting to emerge. He didn't know what to do with the emotions that Carla was stirring in him, the desire to protect his son and the growing realization that she had become a part of their lives in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I'll need some time to think about this," Kaio said quietly. Carla nodded, not expecting anything else. She wasn't asking for his permission anymore. She just wanted him to understand one thing. "I'm not leaving," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "Not now. Not ever." The days that followed were a blur. The once celebratory atmosphere of the Fraga mansion had turned tense, like the calm before a storm. Carla felt the weight of her decision more with each passing hour, the heavy burden of the love she had given Thomas, and now the consequences of it. Every glance from Kaio, every whispered conversation in the hallway, reminded her of the line she had crossed, one she hadn't even known existed until it was too late. Thomas clung to her more than ever, his innocent need for affection growing with each day. He had grown attached to her in ways that both warmed her heart and terrified her. She was his anchor in a sea of confusion, and no matter what Kaio said, Carla couldn't bring herself to walk away from him. But it was impossible to ignore the tension in the house. Kaio was distant, his eyes often searching her face as if he were trying to understand something he couldn't quite put into words. There were moments when their gazes met, and in those brief seconds, the unspoken questions hung in the air between them. Could they coexist in this fragile new dynamic? Could they find a way to bridge the gap between their worlds? One evening, Kaio called Carla into the study. She entered hesitantly, her heart in her throat. He was standing by the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds, his posture stiff as though he had been waiting for her. "Carla," he began, turning slowly to face her. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what you've done for Thomas." Her breath caught. She didn't know where this conversation was going, but the words he had spoken earlier still lingered in her mind. "I appreciate what you've done for my son," Kaio continued, his voice steady but his eyes betraying something deeper. "And I'm not going to pretend that this hasn't changed everything between us. But I also know that I can't just push you away because things are complicated. Thomas, he needs you. And, in a way, I think I do too." Carla felt her chest tighten. Was this the apology she had been waiting for? Or was this the beginning of something more? "But I need you to understand," Kaio said, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "We're not the same people we were before all of this. Things have changed, and I don't know what comes next. But I'm willing to figure out if you are." Carla stood there, staring at him, her emotions swirling inside her. She had never imagined this moment, but now it felt like everything was hanging in the balance. Was she ready to take the next step, knowing how much was at stake? For the first time since all of this had begun, Carla felt a sliver of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Not perfectly, not without its complications, but together. "I'm ready, Kaio," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than she had intended. "I'm ready to try."